Our passage this afternoon comes to us from the book of Ruth, which is what we've been going through in our English community on Sundays. We are coming to the end of it. We're in chapter 4, where Ruth and Naomi are sort of at the end of their time, at the end of their rope. They have lost everything, and yet here in the passage that we look at, we see that God makes himself known to them through the redemption offered through Boaz. And so we're going to look briefly at that. But let me pray before we dig in this afternoon. Jesus, I give you thanks for your word, for this story, and for the reminder of who we are in you. And I pray that you would speak it deeply into our hearts and lives as we hear from you. It's in your name we pray. Amen. Our passage comes from Ruth chapter 4. I'm just going to read it briefly here. Now Boaz had gone up to the gate and sat down there, and behold, the Redeemer, of whom Boaz had spoken, came by. And so Boaz said, "Turn aside, friend, sit down here." And he turned aside and he sat down. And he took 10 men and the elders of the city, and he said, "Sit down here." And so they sat down. And then he said to the Redeemer, "Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling a parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. So that I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here, and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it. But if you will not, tell me, that I may know, for there is no one besides you to redeem it. And I come after you." And he said, "I will redeem it." And then Boaz said, "The day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth, the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance." And then the Redeemer said, "I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption for yourself, for I cannot redeem it." Now this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging. To confirm a transaction, the one drew off his sandal and gave it to the other. And this was the manner of attesting in Israel. And so when the Redeemer said to Boaz, "Buy it for yourself," he drew off his sandal. Then Boaz said to his elders and all the people, "You are witnesses this day that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech, and all that belonged to Chilion and Mahlon. Also Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon, I have bought to be my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead and his inheritance, that the name of the dead may be cut off from among his brothers and from the gate of his native place. You are witnesses this day." Then all the people who were at the gate and all the elders said, "We are witnesses. May the Lord make this woman, who is coming into your house, like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you act worthily in Apatarath, to be renowned in Bethlehem. And may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring that the Lord will give you by this young woman." You know, sometimes in life, we don't get what we want or what we would expect or what we would hope for. I remember being a kid, growing up. My family was pretty poor. We often struggled to make ends meet. And I remember we had Christmas one year, and we traveled to my grandmother's house, and we was there at our grandmother's house that all of our extended family gathered together. One big, huge celebration. Tons of cousins and grandkids, tons of stuff under the tree. And I remember that year in particular, this is going to date how old I am, but I wanted an original Nintendo Entertainment System. I wanted the original NES. And I remember wanting that more than anything else. You know, I saw all the commercials, I had friends that had it, and I remember getting under the Christmas tree, you know, shaking all the gifts, looking at what was there, hopeful for that moment that I could open that gift, and only to be disappointed. Later on that same morning, my grandfather handed my grandmother a rather large gift. She opened it up, and lo and behold, it was a Nintendo Entertainment System. And I said, "Whoa, this must be a mistake. Santa must have gotten it wrong. That was supposed to be for me. Well, my grandmother doesn't even play video games. What is this all about? Why would he give this to her?" And as I think about that moment, my grandfather obviously knew that my grandmother wasn't going to play that. He bought it for us. But But as a kid, as a 10-year-old, I had no idea. My parents, maybe in their infinite wisdom, knew that I would be so consumed with that gaming system that I would never leave my room or the television, for that matter. And so they decided not to buy it for me. Or maybe they just didn't have the means or the money to be able to do so. There was a bigger reality in play here. My grandfather knew that we would be staying with them, that we would spend extended time in their house, and he wanted to make our time fun. And so what I couldn't see was that my parents were directing my grandparents to buy one for us. The story of Ruth is really a story of God's faithfulness, not just to Naomi and Ruth, but to Israel itself. Before they could even ask for a king, God was working behind the scenes to bring about what they needed when they needed it. And so, with that, just a couple of observations about our passage. The first is that God knows your name. He knows your name and he knows your story. Boaz begins this whole section talking and seeking after one who would be the kinsman redeemer. That redeemer has no name. Just as when Ruth went into Bethlehem for the first time, Naomi makes no mention of her name. She's nameless when all the people come out. This kinsman redeemer has no name. And he has no name, and he would buy... now, there's a little bit of a historical thing going on here. This redeemer would be charged to not only buy the land, but as a part of that land that Naomi owned, he would buy that from her. He would also receive an inheritance from that land. He would receive all the blessings that come from purchasing it. In addition, he would also receive Ruth as his wife. The Moabite woman, the one who was from outside, the one who didn't belong, who was not an Israelite, he would receive her to be married. This is like an oh, by the way, but it's a kind of a bigger deal. Oh, by the way, you've got, I've got this woman here that you can marry. This presented challenges to the nameless redeemer. If you were to have a child with Ruth, that child would inherit wealth. And that would leave all of his previous children and himself with nothing as a result of that. And so it would have cost him something very valuable. The cost of this ministry to this family was too high. It was too precious. And so he was out. The deal is confirmed later on by Boaz exchanging a sandal, which is another cultural thing that's kind of going on here. This was a customary way of preserving the name of the family that would inherit the deal. There's this exchange going on, this great exchange of I will care for this family, I will care for the needs of these people, and I will demonstrate that publicly here. With no one left to redeem this family, Boaz was it. He was the only hope here. God's faithfulness was not uncertain in this moment. It was very certain. God knew what the plan was. He knew for Ruth and Naomi that there was hope, that there would be something more for them, that they would not die in poverty, but that God was on the move and working. Notice the names that are remembered here in our passage. There's Ruth, there's Boaz, there's Elimelech, there's Naomi. All of these folks are mentioned. And the no-named redeemer, the one who could have stepped in, is never mentioned again. I'm reminded here of 1 Corinthians 1:25, which teaches us that the pathway of loving our neighbor well, of caring for others, starts with understanding our weakness. For Paul writes, he says, "For the foolishness of God is wiser than human wisdom, and the weakness of God is stronger than human strength." God's paradigm for the world is not our paradigm. God used an unlikely man who had a generous heart to care for those who were weak, to care for those who had no voice, to care for those who had no cultural arrogance or ability. He used an unlikely person to bring blessing to the world. And by his faithfulness, by Boaz stepping into that situation, God would eventually bless all of us around the world. We would be inheritance of that family. Because see, David would become his great-grandson, and then Jesus, a descendant of David, and then we are the sons and daughters of the King by virtue of our union with Christ. You know, when the gospel gets a hold of you, when it gets into your heart, it changes things. It changes how you see other people. It changes how you see the world. It gives you eyes to see where God is on the move. And then your time, your talent, your treasures, they don't become your own anymore because you're just the recipient of the grace that God has given you. If God is working around you, you get to then bear that out where you are. Never is this more known or more made known when we encounter it personally, where someone who has no obligation to us loves us just because we are. When I was growing up in Atlanta, I grew up in a very poor part of the city. And I went to work for a very large church, but it was very far away, and it was very hard to get there. And a family in that church had made a lot of money. The guy who was the husband and wife, the father had owned a voicemail company, and he sold it and retired early, and he got a very large house, 7 bedrooms, 5 bathrooms, they had 4 sons, a very, very large place. But at some point in his life, he began to realize that his possessions didn't possess him, that God could use those things, those blessings that God has given him to bless other people. And so he began to open up his home to those in need. At one point, I ended up moving in and living with this family. I lived in their basement, and it was 5 minutes from the church, and it allowed me to do ministry and live off of support and all this other stuff. At one point, I remember counting in Christmas how many people lived in their house. So we had the mom and the dad, so that was 2. We had 3 sons that were home for Christmas, that was 5 total. And then they had the Russian foreign exchange student that lived with them, that's 6. They had her mother and father lived with them, so that was 8. They had me, so that was 9. Then they had a woman that was coming out of the adult industry, and so she had 3 kids, and then she lived in the basement, and that was 13. They had, it was I think we got up to 17 people living in this house at one time, sharing life together. Why? What would compel somebody to do that? I can't even get my head around the 3 kids that I have in my house at any one time, right? What would compel somebody to love the unlovely, to open their home, their life, as it talks about in Thessalonians? When the gospel gets into your heart, it changes how you see everything. You see, God not only knows your name, He knows your story. He knows how you've been wired. He knows your needs. He knows you. And what He wants is not your performance, not your ability. He wants you, all of you. You see, Boaz, through no ability of his own, saw this outsider, Ruth, who was able by God's grace to give her a new name. No longer was she the nameless widow, the foreigner in chapter 1. No, she was the wife of Boaz and the mother of Obed. She was given a new name and a new story. Christ gives you and I a new name. No longer are we sinners or orphans, but we've been called friends by virtue of our union with Christ. In Jesus, we are His friends. And the love of Jesus is far greater than the love of Boaz for Ruth, or Ruth for Naomi. You see, He left His comfort and eternity. He left the eternal presence of the Father so that we could be redeemed sinners, so that we could be a new people gathered together to worship the one who will come again and make all things new. This is the power of the resurrected Christ. It's a power that transcends our cultural identity. It transcends our local experience. It transcends everything, and it connects us together. It's Christ in us, the hope of our salvation. Friends, it's good news. Father, thank you that, Lord, you know our name, you know our story, Lord, and you came in spite of what you know about us. I pray that, Lord, as we go into this week of Thanksgiving, Lord, that our hearts would be reminded that every good and perfect gift comes from you, our Father above. Lord, would you be near to us, and would you give us joy for the many blessings you've given us in Christ. It's in your name we pray. Amen.